Hi there guys, and welcome back to Same Ship, Different Day. So this is it. My quarantine is over, my familiarization is done, and I'm finally ready to start doing the job I set out to do over 2 weeks ago when I left home. I can take over now after 7 months at home and finishing all of this process. I can now take over as senior second here on board the Pacific Explorer starting tomorrow. So I want to run you through everything that I've been through, give you a bit more of a timeline over what you've already seen, a bit more footage from what happened during my quarantine process, and also the familiarization where we had to go all over the ship and do lots of reading and lots of research and spend lots of time making sure that our knowledge was up to scratch, including an interview with both, with 3 people, the safety officer, the staff captain and the captain, who were all serving on board prior to me joining. So I'm going to run through all of that, and hopefully you'll learn something as I go through it. So if that sounds good to you, we'll crack straight on. So before I begin, guys, as always, my views and opinions do not reflect those of my employer. This is just me making some videos, hopefully filling you in a little bit on what's been going on and the difficult process we're having at the minute of getting crew on board, and from the point of leaving home all the way to taking over and doing the job itself. It's a long process. But I think the first thing to do is, now that I'm officially familiarized and I've been signed off by the captain, I think I'm gonna have to do a bit of a costume change. So here we go. Well, that's better, isn't it? Recognize me now? I'm in my uniform, finally ready to take over as senior second here on board Pacific Explorer. For those of you who don't already know my rank, senior second, so 5th in command if you like, but it's a strange example. It's like Princess Eugenie in line to the throne. Anyway, let's start then with what happened. I left home on the 18th of February following a PCR test. Obviously sent off to the lab and came back negative within 3 days of me leaving. Flew out here. On the way I did have to get another COVID test in Paris in order to fly via Amsterdam in the end, and then jumped on the charter flight from Rome over to Sri Lanka, where I joined the Pacific Encounter. As I joined the Pacific Encounter, I had yet another COVID test. So that was on the 19th of February, and I began my hard quarantine process. So hard quarantine, to sum it up, is very much you're confined to your cabin. In this particular example of us on board the Encounter, due to the lack of manning really, and the impossibility of having all our meals delivered to the cabins, we were able and had to leave our cabins to go to collect our food in a buffet style, obviously keeping a distance the entire time, a social distance. Collect our food and then bring it back to the cabin for consumption, and then again we leave our plates and everything outside, and they were collected for us, in fact. So we're keeping movement around the vessel to an absolute minimum, and the section of the vessel on the Encounter that we were allowed to go to, or transit if you like, to get our food was completely blocked off to the rest of the crew, to again ensure that distance, even though we'd all been tested already 2 or 3 times in order to get to that stage. So hard quarantine then is required under the company regulations at the moment for 7 days for joining in Asia, but I actually ended up doing 8 days because of just the way it worked out to transition over to the Explorer. So at the end of that 8-day process, I then jumped on a tender over to the Explorer, as you're very much aware, and joined there. Before leaving the Encounter, actually, I did do another test on day 7 at the end of the hard quarantine to ensure that we are allowed to leave it, which again obviously came back negative. Done on board using the onboard facilities, very expensive by the sounds of it, so what I've heard. That allowed me then to transition over to the Pacific Explorer. The time on the Encounter was quite interesting, obviously just being stuck in the cabin for a long period of time. At first it was good to rest after that long travel, but after a while you do get a little bit bored, and you're sort of itching to get over and start the next phase of the contract. Food wise was pretty good. It was buffet line, and obviously it was a difficult situation for everybody, so food at the end of the day, can't really complain. So once we're over on the once I'm over on the Explorer, I was able to start the soft quarantine process. So the day we arrived, we'd already been tested the day before, so it wasn't necessary to have another test when joining the Explorer. But we did actually have a flu jab that day because it's, I think, Australian law that all crew members must have a flu jab when joining one of their ships, or a ship that would be operational in Australia. So we did have that Southern Hemisphere flu jab on the 28th, and then we were able on the 29th to start our familiarisation during soft quarantine. So this essentially means then there's two parts of the ship sort of separated up. Soft quarantine area, where the soft quarantine crew members are allowed to transition. We can wear our normal masks. We go down to food, again collection food, and food only eaten in the cabin, and again food was quite good. At this point there was only 40 of us or so, in addition to the normal crew members that we have at the moment. And then when entering the non-soft quarantine area, we are required to wear an N95 mask, which is a bit of a higher level mask and therefore stops more transition to and from the atmosphere around you. Obviously, I say again, we have already been tested 3 or 4 times at this stage, but precautions first. This is regulation. So, and at that point, when we can move around the vessel, that allows us to go just for work purposes. So that means I can go up to the bridge, start my familiarisation, and also move around the ship as well. It is required for us to have a very thorough knowledge of the ship itself. So, talking familiarisation then, let's have a look at what is required of me as a joining deck officer, as a senior second, what they expect us to go through and learn within the first few days prior to taking over. Obviously we also have to do a handover, which is more in depth to do with my job itself. I'll probably talk more about my job in a future video. Today I'll just say I conducted the handover whilst going through the familiarisation process. So it was an interesting familiarisation for me. Normally you find yourself more or less on your own doing this process, because you'll just be joining one believer for one officer, you know, and you'll have a few days depending on what your experience is on that vessel, and also what your experience is in rank, and the number of days you have to do varies depending on that. In this scenario, basically the whole bridge team swapping at the same time, so there's a whole bunch of us doing the same familiarisation and going through it basically together, which is a benefit for sure, but also meant that we had to kind of coordinate ourselves to move around the ship together. Otherwise you'll find yourself covering the same things individually, which is essentially a bit of a waste of time, and for anybody working that we need to involve in that process obviously isn't very efficient at all. So we find ourselves going around mainly the main group, and that also allows you to sort of ask each other questions as well as ask the questions to the people who are already on board. So quite an interesting and a new experience for me in that case. We had 8 days between joining and finally taking over the watch, and therefore within those first 7 days or so we had to make sure the full familiarisation was completed and signed off. So let's run a little bit quickly through the familiarisation topics that were expected. As you can see, these are all double-sided. There's 9 pages of topics that we have to go through and ensure that we have a thorough knowledge on. Let's do the highlights. So the first section that we have is policies and procedures, so that runs through safety management, operational, emergency response, and then the next section you go into is the bridge watch, so running through all the bridge equipment. Obviously this is done mainly with the guys that are leaving, asking them questions about, you know, any special things for this vessel. I was fortunate enough to be the only person that had been on the ship before, which was still 3 years ago, so it was over the 2-year requirement in order to not have to do a full familiarisation. So I too had to do a full familiarisation as well, but I had a little bit of a head start on the other guys. All the rest of the bridge team pretty much had not been on this ship, and had only had limited experience on this class of ship as well. So there was a lot to go through obviously for everybody and make sure we were quite happy before taking over. When you get onto the bridge watch section, obviously there's all the administration side as well as just the equipment and learning the manoeuvrability of the ship as well. This is something that takes a lot of hours of study and checking each piece of equipment as you go around the bridge. And again, you can have the guys on watch, the guys that are working there, help you out and learn a little bit more on that, and you go through one by one on that equipment. That goes on for a very long list, as obviously it's very important and there's a lot to go through. Here's some examples: multi-pilot, operational navigation, command system, alternative, meteorology, ECDIS, maneuvering equipment, ASIPOD's not applicable, stabilizers, voyage data recorder, CCTV system, even things like this, gyro, magnetic compass. And then after that, Part of that bridge as well is the safety centre, which has its own category, so lots of things to go through there. It's very important that we know a lot about all the fire suppression systems and the firefighting equipment we have on board as well. So that actually takes a lot of walking around the ship, as well as just sitting in the safety centre and reading through the manuals, checking all the equipment and the overview we have from there. Again, that goes on for several pages, including going through the ship's stability requirements and the onboard NAPA system that we have that measures and monitors the stability of the vessel. Then with final category that we have is the ship's layout. So again, going through all the high risk areas around the vessel, checking out everything, including we did a full tour of the engine room as well with one of the senior first engineer to familiarise ourselves with that layout. It's actually quite an interesting thing as a deck officer. You probably have more of an overview of the entire vessel, as you'd expect, than anyone else on board. Obviously the captain is the manager of the entire operation, so he has to have a good understanding, and therefore that starts at the early stages as a deck officer. And we monitor the safety for the entire ship, so we need to understand if we're sending someone into a situation and into a place, we need to know what that looks like. We need to know what firefighting systems we have in that area, shutdown systems, everything else. So I'd say the deck officers on board probably have a greater understanding over the entire ship than any other rank. However, obviously all the details that come under that, especially the engine room, okay, we have a familiarization and we know, the layout, and we have a basic understanding of some of the equipment, but nothing compared to the guys that are actually working down there day in, day out. So it's interesting and a very good actual exercise to go and familiarize yourself and talk to the guys, and you find yourself asking questions that maybe you never even thought of before, just because you have a different engineer going out and pointing out something different. So that process took about a week, and then finally, having finished that, we then have to go for one-on-one interviews with those three big players, as I discussed before. The safety officer, who's the manager, so he usually runs through the bridge equipment itself, again making sure we're fully familiar with that. He'll also run through the safety aspects, such as the lifeboats, the launching, life rafts as we have on this vessel, all that kind of thing. And so he goes into a little bit more detail, not really you'd say grilling you, but making sure you have a complete understanding of what we have on board. And he'll also throw a few things at you, a few extra tips as well that you might not have thought of, but will have come from his experience on board the ship, or her experience, depending on the situation. In this case it was male. Then we go to the staff captain. He's head of the deck department. He's my boss, if you like, and he basically goes through more to do with the job, the expectations within the role, especially as in my position as senior officer, and so managing a bridge team, and then also various things around the deck department and around the ship that might be required for me to know during this contract. Once he's happy and signed off, you then finally go to the captain. Now the captain has obviously probably the most important. He goes less probably into the details and talks more about your how comfortable you feel on board, how the handover has gone, to make sure you have a proper handover from the leaving officer. He will also ensure that you're of a level and a standard high enough to take the watch and to have the responsibility of the charge of the vessel, which I have on his behalf, 8 hours a day. So it's a very important part. The captains usually they have a good understanding of each person's capabilities and their experience, and so they are giving you the final sign off to say you're ready to go. Then in the end you finally get the sign off sheet gone through with all the ranks. I obviously haven't shown you the actual one of mine, but then it highlights the 4 stages of the familiarization, and then it's signed by yourself to say that you're happy with that and that you got your full handover, the bridge manager, safety officer, the staff captain and the captain, to say that you're good to go. So finally, we usually finish that about a day or 2 before we actually take over, depending on the situation on the ship. In this case it was about a day before, and then you start to shadow, if you're not already on the watch, with the guy that you're handing over from, just to get used to the routine of the watch. Even at the moment it's very quiet, sat at anchor, but just to understand what's expected. There's a few changes that have happened from the normal manning and the normal operation to this reduced manning that we have on board, and so there's less, especially for me at night, there's less people available, less people around for me to get in touch with should I need anything, and so that sort of thing is important to know as well. And then, yeah, finally we get to this stage now, which is me taking the watch, taking the charge of the vessel for 8 hours a day. It will be myself on the bridge with my junior officer, who's the third officer. And whilst we're at anchor, that will just be the two of us. And then at sea, I'll have two helmsmen as well, that obviously will form part of my team. So it's an exciting time now to finally get hands-on doing the job. From this point onwards, I'll be showing you more around the ship. Obviously during both quarantine stages, unless it was an essential for work reason to go around the ship, I was not permitted to. So no gym and things, so I'm ready to get back in the gym and enjoy myself a little bit. We do have a pool filled up on the open deck, and one of the bars open in the evenings as well. So it would be nice to get out there and enjoy myself and enjoy this warm weather after coming from a very cold England. Anyway, I think I rambled on enough. Hopefully you found this interesting to hear about the process of taking over on one of these vessels. It's not just a handover same day job, although I'm not going to say it can't be, because I have done that many times. If you're very familiar with the vessel, if you've been on before recently, especially if you're just coming back to the same team, the same vessel, and if you're experienced in the rank, then you are permitted to do a same day handover. Obviously at the minute, with all the quarantine process and things that's required, that's not going to be happening. But I thought I'd run you through that process and maybe you have a bit more understanding of the extra effort we're going to at the moment for both the quarantine as well as the usual familiarisation. I can tell you that running around the ship with an N95 mask on is not an enjoyable experience, especially in 30-degree heat and 90% humidity, but it was something that was required in order to do this familiarisation and make sure I have the level of knowledge required to do this job properly. Anyway, thanks for joining me on this one. If you did like it, please do leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be bringing you lots of more content whilst I'm on board this vessel. Until then, guys, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for sticking with me right through to the end on this one, guys. Your reward this time is a beautiful still sunset here at OPL Anchorage, Singapore. As we come round, you can just see the shadow of the Crown Princess in the setting sun. A stunning scene, I'm sure you agree, and one that I'm sure many of you are missing. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.